So yeah, that's the main one for this week that we've got going on. And it's back to school, so that means our youth group is starting up, and it's going to be every Tuesday at 6:30, and then you need to pick up your kids at 8. If you can't get here by 8, I'm taking them home with me. No, I'm just kidding. I'll wait for you. But yeah, so that's starting up. It's going to be really fun. We've got a bunch of kids that are part of this church, and we've got kids that come that are not, their parents are not a part of this church. It's a great group. If you've ever considered working with youth, I highly recommend it. I was so fearful of the youth for so long, and now I am just really enjoying it. So I don't know if there's something holding someone back out there. Maybe you've thought about it, but you're just not 100% sure that, teenagers are kind of intimidating. I see one over there, and I felt immediately intimidated, Stevie. Just kidding. But we are looking for volunteers to help out with the youth group. It's on Tuesdays at 6:30. It's, you just play. You just play with kids. It's really fun. You talk to them, listen to them. They don't really want you to talk to them. They just want to be listened to, really. So, yeah, it's a really good time. So, yeah, that's what we've got going on this week at the Vineyard. And I think I just want to say a big thank you because you guys are making this happen. We are in this building because of your financial donations, and we are so, so grateful. And speaking of gratitude, we're also grateful for all of you that volunteer your time. Not everyone can give an abundance out of their pocket, but a lot of you are giving out of your time and your heart, and we're so, so grateful. One man in particular that I'm grateful for is my husband back there hiding behind the computer. He is here every Sunday to help make sure that the worship words are on the screen and that what you see up there is, what you want to see. So big shout out to my hubby, Ben. He's super introverted, but if you say hi to him, he'll love it. So, yeah, thank you all so much for everything that you do and just for being here and making this a community that I am so proud to raise my family in. So, yeah. Well, maybe just take a few minutes to greet someone close to you and say hello, stretch, and we're going to have a time of teaching. It's the Watchful Servant series, and yeah, that's it. Say hello to someone. Do you need this?
Yeah, I think so. All right. If you guys could start making your way back while I finish situating the stand. Somebody sent me an article one time, some little joke article about what your pastor's pulpit says about their theology. Have you guys ever read that one? It's pretty funny. But the music stand doesn't rank up very high in their rating scale. But all right, well, why don't we just take a minute collectively here just to check in on ourselves. Just sort of settle into where you're sitting, maybe take a few deep breaths if that's helpful. Just pay attention to what is happening in your head, the thoughts that are coming through. Pay attention to the emotions you might be feeling. What's your heart telling you? Give a minute to consider just kind of what you're doing here. Of all the places you could have been this morning, you chose here. And what is it that you're hoping for in this time? And just observe these things. And I'll pray and ask Holy Spirit that we would experience the grace to remain grounded down here in the deepest part of who we are, where we're already experiencing rest. We're resting in your presence as your presence rests in us. And we just ask that any thinking, hearing, speaking, doing, all of these things may come from the same place and arrive in the same place. May we live what you prayed, Jesus, that we would be one, just as you are one. Amen. All right. How was everybody this morning? Mm-hmm. Got up really early with Jess to watch a little meteor shower. It's pretty cool. Saw some meteors. They're all different, you know? Some of them have a little tail behind them. Some of them are orange, some of them are white. It's quite exciting. But I've already been awake for like 11 hours today, so bear with me. So we're gonna continue along in the series we've been. This is part 14 of the series Parabola, around the parables, the teachings of Jesus. And this morning we're gonna look at a parable he tells in Luke's Gospel. It's been titled "The Watchful Servants." Before we get to the scripture, though, I'm gonna open with a poem. This is one of my all-time favorites. It's called "A Ritual to Read to Each Other." It's by William Stafford. It reads, "If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible errors of childhood, storming out to play through the broken dike. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail. But if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs, but not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no, or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. So here's a story that Jesus tells. It's recorded in Luke 12. And Jesus says this. He says, "Be dressed and ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. It'll be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will dress himself to serve. The master will dress himself to be the servant, and the servants will recline at the table, and the master will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the middle of the night or towards daybreak. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. And you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you don't expect him." All right. It's pretty juicy. What's your, how do you feel after hearing that story? What's your immediate reaction? Mm-hmm. Stay awake. Yeah, it's a pretty clear message, it seems, right? Not too mysterious, maybe. Stay awake. Stay awake when? How long? Yes. All right, let me ask this. So in reading this, well, actually, let me start with this question. So when you think of Jesus, just, for a second, whether you're very familiar with the scriptures or not, any answer is fine. When you think of Jesus and sort of the titles bestowed upon him, either during his time here or after, what are some of the things you think of? What did people call Jesus? And maybe how do you think of Jesus' relationship to you? Counselor, comforter, teacher. A friend. An example, a role model, a guide. A healer. Brother and friend. King of Kings. The Lamb, Savior. Oh, you guys are like in stereo. It amazes me what aspects of who Jesus seems to be resonate with different people and how different our experiences can be from each other. And how frightening that is for some. To be honest with how it is that you experience Jesus and realizing that it's okay, however it is. Just wild thing about being okay with things as they are. I don't know that our agreement with life circumstances, like becoming honest with ourselves and honest with our circumstances and learning to be okay with them, changes the circumstances, but it changes us so much that the circumstances don't really matter anymore. It does seem to be critical. At least we can greatly reduce our suffering when we make peace with the truth of how we actually feel and our life as it actually is. So interestingly, none of you relate to Jesus as the Son of Man. Didn't hear anybody say Son of Man. You guys know this one? Son of Man. It's in the story. He says the Son of Man will come, kind of like a thief in the night. How about this little tidbit? This will be good for Bible trivia night over at European Street. Do they do that? They probably don't do that. Jesus' favorite, his preferred self-descriptor, what he referred to himself as, more than any other title, was Son of Man. Almost 70 times, that's what he called himself. Seems to be that's the one he settled on, that felt the most honest, or that was the most recorded, Son of Man. What does it mean? What's this title? Well, it's kind of weird, and nobody really knows. There is a reference to it in this prophetic book of Daniel in the Old Testament, Son of Man who comes like a judge. Jesus sometimes referred as Son of Man in this role as judge, but it seemed more often than not when he referred to himself as Son of Man, he was referring to himself as a brother, like part of the fabric of humanity. And all right, so this is a little theology warning. It's gonna get theological for a minute. You guys, everybody all right with that? You like theology? Is that a yes I hear from the front row? So foundational to Christian theology is this concept, this idea of the Trinity, right? That God is one and that God is three in one. This is a greatly confusing doctrine to the other monotheistic religions who, from the outside, it appears that Christianity is, fallen off a cliff into polytheism. It's really difficult to explain. I grew up in the church for a long time. I've heard lots of different metaphors to try to capture what it is we mean when we say God is one and God is three. Like what are some of your favorites? Yes, any an egg? Yeah, because the egg's what? Life. The shell. The shell, the yolk, and what else is happening in there? Oh, the egg white. Okay. So is the white the sun? And then the shell must be the shell would have to be the sun. Three-leaf clover? Yeah. Distinct but one. What's it? You said Cancun? Oh, a candy cane? I don't know, really?
They have 3 stripes that go up them.
Yeah.
3 stripes are supposed to be something to do with
The Trinity. Explained in a delicious seasonal treat. As Gregory of Nyssa actually came up with the candy cane, trying to explain it to his school outside of Athens. Water, ice. What's the last one? Steam? Air. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that. That's the one I know too. Yeah, we don't have to figure this out this morning. It's all right. I got up early. We'll do it next week. One of the more beautiful aspects, I suppose, of considering God in this way, and when we say considering God, we're also talking about like foundational reality, like the actual what is, the ground of being God. The first picture we have is in Genesis 1, and God says to God's self, "Come, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." God refers to himself in plural, as if there is this conversation that's already been happening, and out of the flow of this conversation, out of the flow of this relationship, everything that is came into being. And so there's this picture, this notion of God and therefore reality itself as continuous, unbroken, harmonious relationship. There's this icon, I think it's up here. This Father pouring into Son, Son pouring into Spirit, Spirit pouring into Father. Always emptying, self-emptying. There's this theological term called kenosis. It means self-emptying. That the nature of God is self-emptying love. That the nature of reality is self-giving love. There's a writer named Cynthia Boudgeau, this book called Wisdom Jesus, but she talks about Jesus' approach. He wasn't an ascetic. His method towards enlightenment or to awakening or salvation or whatever you want to call it wasn't one of denial, of sort of escaping the world's trouble. He just put himself in every situation, but he didn't cling to anything. That's what she said. And rather than holding on to anything, he just gave it all away. She calls it a radical squandering. Like he's giving the best stuff away, and I don't even think those people care. there's something a lot more responsible you could be doing with those resources, and just everything is emptying, self-emptying, always coming back to this place of emptiness, because that's where we're filled. And the model for this is the Trinity, this idea of God. And so Christ, Jesus, is the visible manifestation of the Trinity. This is Colossians 1. Christ is the image, the icon. You know the word icon? Do you remember, do they still call him this? I remember when I was a kid, my dad was into computers, and so he had I remember when Windows first, we went from the DOS prompt to Windows. And you used to call those little things now it's like how you launch your app, those little squares. That used to be called an icon, to double-click the icon. Maybe that's still a thing, I don't know. But that's the same word, their image is icon, which is a cool way to think about it. It's like double-click on this picture of Jesus, and what it begins to open into is the vastness of God. So Jesus is the face of God, the image of the invisible, the firstborn of all creation. For in him were created all things in heaven and on earth. And in this place and many other, what our sacred texts seem to be doing is describing Jesus as the supreme archetype. He's not just, he's not just a 2 on the Enneagram. He's 1 through 9. It's this, I don't know what zodiac sign he was born under. It must have been all of them. This idea of a supreme archetype of humanity, this meta-personality. And even the emblem for all of creation, that's what Paul seems to be reaching for. The firstborn of all of creation. The map. You could think of Jesus as the map. And I'm not sure if that word, for me, it's a little more fresh than the way. I've heard the way a long time. But to conceptualize Jesus, his life, as the map. And it's the map that reveals how we consciously participate in the life of God. This is what it looks like. To be awake in God's dream. It's a map that charts the supreme pattern of creation. Can anybody name it? What's the supreme pattern of creation? What is creation telling us over and over and over again? This is what happens. What? Life, death, and our ego stops there. But what happens after that? New life, resurrection, rebirth. What Jesus called the life that's truly life. Life, death, resurrection. Which means that death is a doorway, not a destination. Whether it's death of a dream, the death of our most treasured illusion, some of them you want to hang on to for just a little bit longer. You're like, oh, I really liked that one. I can see it isn't true, but can I have 10 more minutes with it? Death of a relationship, the death of certainty. Certainty goes down swinging, man. Certainty's got energy. Certainty's got energy, and certainty has friends. Certainty always has friends. And they're certain about certainty. And they are skeptical about your questions. Certainty. The death of certainty. It's just another doorway. It's not a destination. If we keep our hearts open, this funny thing can happen in the question zone. In the question zone, what starts to establish itself is, there's some bitterness about what you were sold, turning out to be not exactly all it was cracked up to be. So you can feel kind of duped. And then you start to see first you see one hole, and then you start to see all the holes, and you're like, how does anybody believe this? Can you believe, and this kind of thing. And then other people come around, and they're vibing with that just as much as certainty vibes with certainty, Sarcasm supports itself. And we can really stall out in those places between the station because we're just looking for somewhere to stand, The place we were standing isn't there anymore, and so, doubt can become its own identity. if we keep our heart open, and I was talking to somebody about this the other day and trying to think of a word. Maybe you guys can help me. What's another word for endurance? Like, endurance feels noble. Endurance feels like, I pushed through and I made it. But I feel a lot more like what happens is I almost died and I didn't. Resilience. Perseverance. It's definitely not discipline, at least not in my case. What's desperate? Maybe it's desperation. Maybe it's like when Jesus, all the people leave, right? And he turns to Peter and he's like, what about you, man? You leaving too? And Peter goes, the most honest answer, where am I going to go? I'm already screwed, man. Like, I've came this far. That thing, whatever that is. Survival. Surrender. Oh, that's pretty good. Yeah. And the more surrendering you do, you find out you have so many little hands in here. There's so many of them. They're holding on to stuff in the bushes you didn't even know was there. Surrender. We could talk about death in this way, right? Death is maybe the ultimate surrender. And we fear it because we feel that it's separation. And what the scriptures, what Christ, what the pattern of reality is constantly trying to reassure us is that it's not the end. It isn't separation in its absolute form, but it might be surrender in its absolute form. And that's a pretty frightening enterprise too, if we're honest, I heard somebody describe union with God like this one time, like it's like the river that the river flows into the ocean. This is what coming home to God is like. And I was at the Springs with my kids this week for a couple days, and was watching the spring bubble up from wherever it comes from and flow through its little river and then out into the Swanee, and watching it. You can watch a little bubble go and realize once it hits the Swanee, there's no more saying like that drop right there. That one's from Charles Spring, and that drop, but it still is, but it isn't. And that's when Jesus says, die to yourself. This is what he's talking about. Surrender even our survival mechanisms that wants to continue to say, I am this little drop. And trust. And so what life offers is a series of opportunities to throw up our hands and say, okay, all right. I heard when Eugene Peterson died, his family was around him, and his last words were, let's go. Let's go. I don't think, no, it wasn't like Dude Perfect, I don't think. It was like, let's go. Yeah, right, exactly. No, it was not, I knew it. I don't think that was what it's this life lived with a willingness. He called it a long obedience in the same direction. And what it produces is the ability to surrender ever deeper things. So death isn't the end, it's the prelude to resurrection. Winter isn't the last season, it's just the one that comes before spring, Like people say it's always darkest before the dawn, which is true, but also it's always darkest like right before pitch black. I don't know where you're at on that ride. So Jesus, in this parable, he speaks of being watchful and alert for the Son of Man. His favorite term to describe himself. And it has me wondering if he favored this term over like Son of God or Messiah or King. A lot of times people called him the Messiah, and he would just kind of be like, shh. Especially in Mark's gospel, he's always like, shh, keep that down. They try to rush him to become the king of Israel, and he would literally disappear. Like he uses, like it's the only time we know that he uses teleportation skills. Like it could have come in handy lots of different times, right? One time the Pharisees tried to throw him off a cliff, he disappeared. The other time they tried to make him king and he disappeared. So obviously either extreme. is not the kind of places that he was interested in inhabiting. And so I wonder if he favored the term Son of Man because it best represents his solidarity with all of humanity, with all of us. And what seems to be his obvious intention to awaken in each of us what was already awakened in him. Richard Doris says, I like he uses the word it. Whatever that is, what is it that's awakened? See it in Jesus, believe it in Jesus, admire it in Jesus, love it in Jesus, and let it take shape in your own soul. A couple years ago, I was exposed to like the Eastern, just the Eastern branch of the church. And, the Great Schism, you heard of this thing? There was like 1,500 years or so. There was a mutual excommunication. The Pope said, you're excommunicated. And then the Orthodox guy said, no, you can't do that. You're excommunicated. So then this tradition, like from a pretty early period, like around 500, 600 AD is when that happened. So it only had a couple of hundred, like it had like 150 years with a Bible even, right, that was agreed upon. After that, the tradition split in half and didn't communicate with each other. And it developed on its own until the 60s, because it was the 60s, they made up and somebody invented a jet plane and then the internet. And so now there's conversation happening between, it's just within Christianity. And I got to tell you, man, some of the ways that they talk about the meaning of the gospel, what the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus mean, they're so different. And in the West, for whatever reason, good, bad, or other, there seems to be a real fascination about salvation explaining what it is that we're getting away from. Like God is the judge, hell is what you deserve, Jesus is the way out. And so you're always kind of running to somewhere with the hellfire like still on your heels, you're just trying to get far enough away and I heard somebody call, what happens then is that all of theology, the entire Christian message, what's the good news? We call it the good news. It becomes like a sin management program, and you're just playing kind of like whack-a-mole, where you get this one, and then something else pops up over here, and you're like, oh, someday I'm going to be a good boy. Ah. The concept of it is, at least for me, was so refreshing in the East, but the conclusions are pretty shocking to Western ears. But this is how the churches, the East, the idea was more, if I could summarize it along these lines, it's that there's within each of us a purity, the spark of the divine, the life of God, the breath of God. There's within each of us a purity that cannot be marred, changed, defiled, lost, driven out. We can't grow it ourselves, any more than we can extinguish it. There is something within each of us that is divinely pure. Discover it. This is how the church's first theologians understood the meaning of the Son of Man and what Jesus' life meant. This Irenaeus, 180, all right, so it's just shortly after Jesus' life. He said, the Son of God became what we are in order to make us what he is. He became human that we may become divine. This is St. Augustine. The Son of God became the Son of Man that he might make the sons of men sons of God. It's Gregory and Nyssa, the guy that invented the candy cane. The Word became incarnate so that by becoming as we are as God is. He became like us, that is, a human being, that we might become like him, and I mean gods and sons. It's the language of union. And there's a part of us that is very afraid of it, it's because it's kind of like, I don't know, I'll just let you in on my process here. Remember the thing that remember that snake in the garden? Remember what he had to say? right? He kind of appeals to the ego and says, like, don't you want to be like God? You know, like, garden's pretty good, but you could probably do a better job. Let's be honest. So I've reflected on that. It seems to me that the word like is the problem there. It's the comparison. It begins with the idea of separation. And then it produces within the separate self the idea that we need to earn our way back to some place, you know. And we all have a variety of ways to try to earn our way back to somewhere that we already are. And as Jesus taught it, we don't grow our way into salvation. We're not lurching from victory to victory until finally we achieve our true self, you know. Jesus' message is you die into it. You surrender into it. Thomas Keating said, you can chart salvation like this. It's a series of necessary humiliations to the false self. That kind of makes humiliation not, you know, it's still not very pleasant, but when we locate its purpose is to help us in the process of surrender, we can work with it. It's 1 John 3:2. He says, beloved, now, it's here. It's already happening. We're the children of God. And what we will be is not yet known. But as Christ is seen, as Christ is made manifest, we shall be as he is. For we will see him as he truly is. For we will see reality as it actually is. Anybody have anything? It's a pretty open-ended question. It's not a very good question to ask. You know, they're supposed to be more specific than that. I get it. That's on me. That's on me. All right, so back to the parable that we read here. Right, it's got a pretty straightforward interpretation, and you know, it's stay awake, wake up, be vigilant. Resist the ever-present temptation to sleepwalk through life. You know, you ever know? Our life can become like whatever it is our brain does when we're driving a car, where we don't even know we're driving it anymore. You know what I mean? Like it's the scariest thing that you ever did. When you were 15, you were terrified. And then you're 40 and you're like, how did I get home? You know? It's weird. Yeah, life there's an ever-present temptation for us to treat our own life like that. And the way it happens is we allow these patterns, that have been programmed into us, just launch in various situations. And we feel like we're living, and sometimes we even feel like we're being unique or original. I'm like, that was a pretty cute response, you know, but anybody who knows us well is like, yeah, you could have seen it coming a million miles away. There's this... I found that the more conscious I am to these patterns, the more of them I find, first of all. And the more I work with them, like if I can just take just a second, like I'll feel the response coming out of my mouth, and every now and then I'm like, ha, you know, I got it, and swallow it back down and see what happens. And what appears to happen is that we can make room for genuinely new things to happen. In spiritual direction, one of the guiding principles is like, let the silence do the heavy lifting. When you're most tempted to say something, somebody needs to say something. Somebody needs to say something. I'm in charge here. I need to say something. I'm the director. It's spiritual direction. I need to direct. I'll say something. If you just like, shh, just calm down. It's amazing what happens on the other side of silence. Patience. So stay awake. Be aware of the ever-present temptation to sleepwalk through life, or just to like give up, just be like, oh, whatever. There's a difference between like waiting. Let's see here. What do you call it when what do you call it in baseball when you're playing left field and nothing ever happens? Nothing ever happens. It's been 11 games and all I've done is gotten a sunburn and become more familiar with the different varieties of wildflowers that are growing out here in the field. Nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, everything happens. And then nothing happens again for a long time. You know that thing? Like, how do you describe the kind of waiting that's necessary to not only play one season of T-ball? Yeah, alert. Yeah. Anticipation. Okay, oh, this is so good. Okay, all right. This is nice. So become aware of your own patterns, your own specific set of impulses and temptations that urge you towards unconscious living. It might be pleasure seeking, it might be overproducing, it might be fantasizing about this or that, it might be people pleasing, it might be domineering, it might be all of those things in the same hour. However much we can become aware of what our particular set of patterns are, the more chance we have of just watching them pass. So be alert and be ready. Keep the lamp of awareness lit. Because Jesus says we don't know the moment when Christ will be made manifest within us or around us. And we want to be there for it, Let me see here. All right, I'm going to skip all this and just say this. And this might be worth mentioning. There's these mixed metaphors that Jesus uses to describe like the sneak attack, the sneak attack of divinity. And one of them, it's like pleasurable. It's actually kind of weird. He talks about the servant-master dynamic. In a lot of his other parables, the servant-master dynamic is like pretty offensive to the part of us that wants justice, because there's that one we've covered already. But Jesus is like, so you're a servant and you like did the stuff you were supposed to do. Like, what do you want, a cookie or something? Just like feed the guy his dinner and maybe you'll get something to eat. That's what the kingdom of God is like. You're like, ouch. In this story, something kind of wild happens, and what happens is the master comes home, and he's so pleased that there were some servants who weren't asleep. There was some aspect of our ego that could stay awake. That the roles reverse, It's the master, God, serving the servant. The servant gets to recline and take the role of the master. It's kind of an interesting little switch there. And so sometimes these things come to us as something pleasant that we've been anticipating, but then he also uses this other metaphor right after that, this thief in the night. That these divine sneak attacks may also come to us as something unpleasant or unexpected. And so this kind of message comes through, and it's that in situations that we might label as fortunate or unfortunate, pleasurable or painful, expected or surprising, beneficial or detrimental, beyond our preferences and judgments, which usually are so inaccurate. How sure we can be of something, and how grateful we can become when we learn that we are totally wrong. We completely misread the situation that never even happened. Beyond our preferences and judgments, the point of this story is that salvation is a matter of attention. This is Simone Weil. She says, attention, taken to its highest degree, is the same thing as prayer. In the desert tradition, there was this method of prayer that was developed, and it was centered around these three principles. And if I were to say I had a spiritual practice that I maintain, this would probably be it. These three principles: agrypnia, apatheia, agape. 3 Greek words. Agrypnia, this first one, it means watching or awake. The root is which is without. Whenever there's an a, it means it cancels out what comes next. Without. Grypnia, the root word is hypnos, which means sleep. It literally means without sleep. It's the exact kind of watchfulness that Jesus describes in this parable, this willingness to forego not just the things that we want, but probably the things that we need. This focus that transcends these things. But let me ask you this. What are you like in the middle of the night when you can't sleep? Angry, grumpy, desperate, please. Frustrated. Yeah. What's that? For years, that's when my little parade of anxiety would come out, There'd be all these little floats going by, and they'd all be getting my attention, and they'd all be, legitimately terrifying. One after another, they would parade out, and I would say, God, please help me go to sleep. I don't want any more. But I think, at least for me, what's happened over time is it's just having to face them, not being able to hide and sleep, has forced me to look at some of these things long enough that you can see that, like, the parade's moving on to the next town, None of it lasts forever, and most of it never happened. Right? So there can be some freedom in foregoing rest to see something through. But what about insomnia? What's the spiritual benefit of never sleeping? Insomnia is not a good thing, is it? No. Nobody's into insomnia. It's torture. Always seeing, never resting. Always seeing, never resting. Always seeing. Is this even good advice that Jesus is giving us in this parable? There's this lyric by Benjamin Gibbard. He says, and I want to know my fate if I keep up this way, because it's hard to want to stay awake. When everyone you meet, they all seem to be asleep, and you wonder if you're missing the dream. So agrypnia, to be watchful, to be wakeful, is a sure slide to insanity, the Desert Fathers determined, unless something called apatheia is developed alongside. Apatheia, it sounds like a word that we know, right? Apathy. Not a very positive connotation to that, Not many people are like, what I like about Bill, he's real apathetic. Will not move, doesn't care. Just like God, apatheia. But we're a pretty fast-paced culture, It's like, fix the problem, make a new one, fix that one. Quit complaining. Apatheia, it's hard to translate. For the Desert Fathers, it meant some combination of indifference, neutrality, or equanimity, level, even keel. Equanimity. Now get this, all right? Apatheia, cancels out the word that comes next, right? Without. Pathos. You know this one? Pathos. It means passion. Right? So for the Desert Fathers, they're like, whoa, man, I'm a mess in here. There's all kinds of stuff that's just firing off all the time, and I'm chasing them all over the place. I got to get some quiet in here without passion. Now, how about this? Pathos is the same word, passion, emotion. It's also the same word for suffering. Right? Now, this is wild, This is wild to me. This language grew out of Greek philosophy. The Greek philosophers were around 500 AD. Have you heard of the axial age? You guys ever looked into this stuff? Like, something happened in humanity. Like, humanity's consciousness leveled up in like 300 years. All these ideas that are incredibly congruent all began to form all across the globe with what we would assume to be very little communication with each other. Like, when I hear the fact that apatheia, that pathos means passion and also suffering, I think, that sounds like Buddhism. Right? I'm pretty sure it's... But at the same time that Buddha was doing his thing under the Bodhi tree, the Greek philosophers were writing. This language was born out of that. The Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, were completed. The Hebrew prophets were prophesying. It was all happening at once. Taoism, Confucianism. I'm working on that one. They all sprung up at the same time, and underlying theme in all these is this idea of it's our passions, it's our emotions, it's our desire that also causes our suffering. And if there's one thing our ego doesn't really like, try to land in neutrality for very long. Like, just stay in neutrality. There's something in us that's like, no. We got to move. We got to be for that or against that. We can't wait till tomorrow. Like, silence is violence. There's so much energy around. Make a stand. And then get one of the signs and put it in your front yard that says the stand, you know. There's this thing in us that's always angling. And in the desert tradition, what became clear is that union is only accessible by means of apatheia. Apatheia elsewhere is called purity of heart. This is Thomas Merton. He says, purity of heart is a total acceptance of ourselves and our situation. Renunciation of all deluded images of ourselves, all exaggerated estimates of our own capacities. And it's only there that we can begin to obey God's will as it comes to us. Evagrius said this, apatheia has a child, and its name is agape. And agape keeps open the door to deep knowledge of the created universe. Apatheia, equanimity, equality, neutrality, has a child. And its child is the greatest ideal that human civilization has ever produced. Agape love, selfless love, self-emptying love, unconditional love. A love that seeks nothing in return, a love that gives just because it's here to give. The scripture's description of who God is. God is love, agape. And if we're honest, God also seems to be profoundly neutral. We may say patient. We may say fair. Jesus talked about this all the time. Said the sun shines on both the righteous and the unrighteous. Like, if it didn't work that way, you could drive down the country roads and you'd know like who the good farmers were that were nice to their people and who the bad farmers were, because, you know, there'd be no rain for the bad guys. Like, beyond good, bad, right, wrong, in, out. There's the love at the bottom of everything that holds us unconditionally and that offers itself to us in all situations and asks nothing in return, but that we enjoy and delight in how it feels to participate with that kind of love. I had to come to terms with how conditional our love actually is, you know, even our unconditional love. And in those moments where we can let go of the conditions and just give, experience what Jesus called the kingdom, freedom. Jesus said, you can't take my life. Yeah, it's yours. I'll give it to you, There's a story of this in feudal Japan. It's been an overthrow of the government, and this shogun government has established itself, and these warriors are going from town to town, and they're killing everyone in power and also all the religious sects. All right, everybody's getting the sword. And so the monasteries are empty. The monks are in hiding. The most fierce of all the warriors arrives at a town, and he gets the report that there's a monk who refuses to go into hiding, and he's sitting in the center of the monastery, and he's just praying. And this enrages this shogun warrior, who marches into the monastery and addresses the monk and says, "Do you know who I am?" And the monk says, "Yes, I know who you are." And he goes, "I'm the person who can run this sword right through your belly." And the monk says, "Do you know who I am?" "I'm the person who can let you run that sword right through my belly." When we talk about salvation, we talk about freedom. And it's a freedom that feels like life as we experience it, as we participate in it. And it's also a freedom that part of us feels terrified of. This is my last thing. Thomas Mertens, at one time he said, he goes, look, "I'm blown like leaves down the street, scattered in all directions. Is this even a life?" Jesus said, "Look, the Spirit's like the wind. Nobody knows where it's coming or where it's going. But we can give ourselves over to the flow. And we can be nice to ourselves when we're having a hard time doing so." All right, this is Peter. Katie, you can come up if you want. Peter, after all, you know how much that guy screwed up, right? He's the one that we like because he's always saying whatever's in his head. And it's, And at the end of a long life, he says this. He says, we've already been given everything that we need. Because God has enabled us to share in the divine nature, to consciously experience life in God as the river flows into the ocean, as the spring flows into the river. And through this, to escape the world's corruption, which is just caused by the stuff we want. No, it's caused by the wanting of the stuff. So we've still got 15 minutes together here, and so Katie, if you want to play, you're welcome to use this time however you'd like. The communion elements will still be available. You can, if there's something that would be helpful to say out loud, you can talk or pray with whoever's next to you. If you'd like a trained professional, you can come over to one of these chairs, and Roberta will come and see you. You can take a nap, you can make a run for the door, you can sing along, worship. So you do you, all right? And I'll let us know when it's 11:30 and we'll dismiss officially. Thank you for being here.